Hi all. This is a story about how my dad got remarried and kicked me out of the house because I was a reminder of his past, a part of his life he wanted to forget. I'm 17 now, nearly 18, but this all started about a year ago when my mum left us. My mum had been having an affair for almost 2 years with someone she knew from high school. Eventually, they decided to make it official. She left, ran off with him for a couple of weeks, and was ready to marry him when she had a change of heart. She came back saying she wanted to do things the right way, so she filed for divorce. When it was finalized, she cut off all contact, moving to Europe with her new husband and leaving me with my dad. Living with my dad wasn't exactly a relief. He didn't get along with me even before my mum left, but after the divorce, it was like he outright hated me. He blamed me for being a constant reminder of the marriage that ended badly and of the life that had humiliated him. My parents had always been big on reputation, how they looked to other people and keeping up appearances. As long as they were together, they kept me around to look like a complete family to others. But things were different now. For most of my life, my parents raised me in a way that seemed fine on the outside. I had clothes, a comfortable home, and all the basic needs. But behind closed doors, it was all about keeping up a perfect image. They never really cared about me. I was just a part of their facade. I was forbidden to talk to anyone about what went on at home, how I was treated, or the fact that I barely had a relationship with my parents. They made it clear that if I ever let anything slip, there would be consequences. And those threats worked. For years, I kept my mouth shut. But everything changed when my dad decided to remarry. He'd been dating his secretary after the divorce was finalized, and it wasn't long before they went public with the relationship. They got engaged a few months ago and were married a couple of weeks ago. I attended the wedding events, but only because he made me. My role was to smile and act like a happy kid who was thrilled for her dad. I played the part, pretending to be okay with this fresh start he wanted so badly. But the truth was, he didn't want me there. To him, I was just a reminder of the past, of the marriage he wanted to forget. A few days after the wedding, my dad and his new wife called me in for a talk. They told me that since they were married now, they didn't want me living with them anymore. They wanted a clean slate, a new beginning with no baggage. And to them, I was the baggage. My dad didn't even pretend to be sorry. He told me I had until the end of the week to pack my things and find somewhere else to go. I was turning 18 soon, after all, and he thought it was high time. I learned to be independent. I tried to reason with them. I told them that I had nowhere else to go, no savings to my name. My dad had always refused to let me work, saying it would look bad if people saw me working when he could easily afford to provide for me, so I'd never had a chance to save up or prepare for this. I wasn't even sure how I would afford college. Even though I'd been accepted to a couple of schools, I still needed funds to secure my spot, and any student loan would require an adult co-signer, but they didn't care. My dad told me it was my problem now, and they both left me sitting in the living room, completely lost. I tried everything to get through to them. I reasoned, argued, and even broke down and begged, but it was no use. They were set on their decision and treated me like an unwanted stranger in the home I'd known all my life. For the first time, I knew I had no other choice. I had to speak up, even if it meant facing the consequences I'd been afraid of for years. After a night of thinking it over, I packed a few things, left the house, and went to my grandparents' place. These were my dad's parents, the only grandparents I'd known. My mum's parents had passed away when I was young, and my dad's parents had always been kind to me, though distant. I'd never told them anything about my life at home. I was too scared that my parents would retaliate if they found out. But now, I was out of options. I sat down with my grandparents and told them everything. The neglect, the expectations, the way my dad treated me like a stain on his perfect image. I explained that he was kicking me out because he didn't want me tainting his new life and that I had nowhere else to go. I half expected them to side with him. After all, they'd raised my dad, and he'd inherited a lot of their focus on reputation and appearances. But to my surprise, they were outraged. They couldn't believe my dad would do something so heartless. They told me that I didn't need to worry about anything. They'd take care of me and support me while I got back on my feet. My grandpa even assured me that I wouldn't have to stress about college or living expenses. He said I'd had enough anxiety for one lifetime and that from now on, they'd be there for me. In a single moment, I felt an enormous weight lift off my shoulders. I was finally safe, finally seen and cared for. I'd spent years believing that if I ever opened up, no one would care and that I'd be punished. And here were my grandparents telling me they'd support me unconditionally. For the first time, I felt like I had a real family, but that's not where it ended. My grandpa did something I never saw coming. He fired my dad from the family company. My dad had been set to take over the business that my great-grandfather had started and passed down through the generations. My grandpa had been gradually preparing to hand the reins to my dad, but after learning how he'd treated me, he wanted nothing to do with him. He even went so far as to revoke my dad's company housing and car, things my dad had only because of my grandpa's generosity. It was a huge, unceremonious fall from grace for my dad, and I heard later that he was threatening to sue my grandpa. But my grandpa didn't flinch. He had good cause to fire him, and he made it clear that he wouldn't tolerate my dad's threats. I later learned that my grandpa had seen signs that my dad wasn't cut out to run the company, and that my dad's position had always been shaky. But it was my story that sealed the deal. My grandpa decided that if his only son was capable of treating his child like this, he wasn't fit to carry on the family legacy. Since that day, I've been living with my grandparents, who have treated me with a kindness and warmth I'd never known at home. They told me they wished I'd come to them sooner, that if they'd known what was happening, they would have stepped in to protect me. I wish I'd known that too, but I was so afraid for so long that I didn't think I had any choice but to endure it. Now, my grandparents are fully supporting me, covering all my expenses, including college. For the first time, I don't have to live with constant worry about where my next meal will come from or how I'll afford school. I can focus on my life, on building a future, and not on surviving my past. I finally feel like I'm in a safe place, and I'm grateful every single day. Life with my grandparents felt like a completely different world. They'd brought me into their home with open arms, making it clear that I was now part of their family, and that I didn't need to look back. I'd never been treated with such care and respect, and every day I was adjusting to the warmth and stability that was so foreign to me. A couple of days after I moved in, my grandparents went to my dad's house to pick up my things. They didn't tell him they were coming. They just showed up, packed up my stuff, and left. They didn't want me anywhere near the place, so I stayed back at their house while they handled it. They told me later that my dad and his new wife tried to put up a front, pretending that nothing unusual was happening, but my grandparents weren't having any of it. They collected everything I needed and left without a word. In the weeks that followed, my grandpa made another big decision. He was going to officially fire my dad from the family company. My grandpa runs a well-known finance firm that my great-grandfather founded years ago, and it's always been the family's pride and legacy. My dad had joined the company a few years ago, and it was assumed he would eventually take over. But after hearing how he treated me, my grandpa decided my dad wasn't fit to lead the company. I'll admit, when I first heard about this, I felt guilty. For years, I'd been conditioned to believe that anything bad that happened in the family was somehow my fault. I even told my grandpa that he didn't need to do this on my account. But he shut that down immediately. He said my dad's treatment of me was just the last straw, and that he'd been concerned about my dad's capabilities for a while. According to my grandpa, my dad wasn't very skilled in business. He'd relied heavily on my grandpa to keep things running smoothly. Now, my grandpa wasn't willing to hand the reins over to someone who couldn't handle the job and who lacked the integrity to lead. It wasn't long before my dad found out he was being fired, and the fallout was immediate. He started calling my grandparents, demanding to know why he was being let go. When he didn't get the answers he wanted, he went on a rampage, threatening to sue my grandpa for wrongful termination. My grandpa didn't seem fazed at all. He had the best legal team in place, and he knew that my dad didn't have much of a case. But that didn't stop my dad from pushing forward, trying to file a lawsuit against his own father. In the meantime, My dad kept texting me, blaming me for everything. He called me vindictive, cruel, and petty, accusing me of turning my grandparents against him out of spite. He even told me I was overreacting by leaving, as if being thrown out of my own home was no big deal. At first, his words got to me. I almost started believing that maybe I'd done something wrong by speaking up. But then I remembered the years of neglect, the way I'd been treated as a burden, and I knew I had every right to leave. Eventually, I stopped reading his messages and began blocking his numbers. Each time he made a new account to reach out to me, I'd just block it again. I could tell he was getting desperate, and that's when he started sending guilt-tripping messages, saying things like, "I did my best as a father," and "You're just a spoiled brat for not appreciating what you had." But I'd finally reached a point where his words couldn't hurt me anymore. Living with my grandparents had shown me what real care and support looked like, and I knew I deserved better than what he'd given me. Things escalated when my grandpa decided to take back the company-owned house my dad was living in. As part of his job, my dad had been given a company home, a perk that came with the position. But now that he'd been fired, he had no right to stay there. My grandpa began the legal process to evict him, which only added fuel to my dad's anger. He had 4 weeks to find a new place, which was far more time than he'd given me. But of course, he still thought he was being treated unfairly. In the meantime, my grandma had been quietly working on buying the house from the company. She wanted to make sure my dad couldn't get his hands on it and planned to transfer it to my name. When my dad found out about this, he lost it completely. He sent me a long, angry message saying I was stealing everything he'd worked for and that I'd destroyed his life. He even accused me of plotting to take over his inheritance, as if I'd had any control over my grandparents' decisions. Once again, I felt a pang of guilt. The house, the inheritance, everything that had been set aside for him was suddenly being transferred to me. It felt surreal, and I wasn't sure how to process it. But my grandparents reassured me that they weren't doing this out of revenge. They just didn't believe my dad deserved those things anymore. My grandpa even told me that he'd spent years giving my dad chances to prove himself, and that he'd always tried to help him succeed. But my dad's behavior toward me had crossed a line, and he couldn't overlook it. Living with my grandparents during all of this was both strange and comforting. They shared a lot of the same values as my dad: punctuality, table manners, and a certain level of formality. But they were genuinely good people. They cared about me in a way my parents never had. My grandma would check in on me each day, making sure I was adjusting well, and my grandpa would take time to talk to me, something my dad had never bothered to do. For the first time, I felt like I had a family who genuinely cared. Through all of this, I couldn't help but think back on how different my life could have been if I'd spoken up sooner. My grandparents told me that if I'd come to them earlier, they would have taken me in right away. But the fear my parents instilled in me had kept me silent. I'd spent years believing that if I ever dared to tell anyone the truth, I'd be punished. And while it was a relief to finally be free of that fear, it was also bittersweet. I couldn't help but wonder if things would have turned out differently if I'd had the courage to reach out sooner. Despite everything, my dad continued his legal battle with my grandpa, refusing to back down. The lawsuit dragged on for weeks, but my grandpa's legal team was prepared. They had all the documentation they needed to prove my dad's incompetence in his role, and it didn't take long for the case to start leaning heavily in my grandpa's favor. Watching it all unfold, I realized just how deep my dad's sense of entitlement ran. He was willing to fight his own father, the man who'd supported him for years, rather than admit he was wrong. As the case neared its end, my dad made one last attempt to reach a settlement. He showed up at my grandparents' house unannounced, trying to persuade them to negotiate out of court. I happened to be the one who answered the door, but he barely even acknowledged me. He went straight to my grandparents, practically begging them to settle. My grandpa, however, refused. He reminded my dad that he'd been the one to file the lawsuit and that if he wanted to pursue it, he'd have to see it through. The conversation grew heated, with my dad accusing my grandparents of turning on him because of me. He even pointed at me, blaming me for everything that had happened. It was a surreal moment hearing him try to pin his failures on me, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to defend myself. I simply walked away, leaving him to face my grandparents alone. Eventually, comma. My dad stormed out of the house, slamming the door on his way out. My grandparents came to my room afterward, reassuring me that I'd done the right thing by not engaging with him. They knew he was trying to manipulate the situation, but they also knew I was stronger than his words now. My grandpa told me that this was a long time coming, that my dad had always taken advantage of their kindness, and that it was time for him to face the consequences of his actions. With the lawsuit heading toward a resolution, I finally felt a sense of closure. I knew my dad would never understand why I'd left or why I'd chosen to speak up, but I also knew I didn't need his understanding or approval. For the first time, I felt like I had a family who truly had my back, and I was ready to leave the past behind and move forward. After my dad's outburst at my grandparents' house, things felt different. I could tell he'd finally realized he was losing control, and that the family he thought would stand by him no matter what was choosing me instead. My grandpa had made it clear he wouldn't back down, and I felt a quiet pride in knowing that my grandparents were willing to stand up for me, even when it meant going against their own son. The lawsuit continued, but it became clear my dad was losing ground quickly. Every time he tried to argue that he'd been wrongfully terminated, my grandpa's lawyers would produce evidence of his poor performance, questionable decisions, and lack of accountability. The whole thing was almost surreal to watch unfold. My dad had always been the one to demand perfection from others, to put down anyone who fell short, and here he was being confronted with his own failures, and he had nowhere left to hide. One day, I overheard my grandparents talking about my dad's history with the company, and I learned things I'd never known before. Apparently, my grandpa had been bailing him out for years, quietly covering up mistakes, even funding failed business ventures to give my dad a chance to find his way. Each time, my dad had promised to turn things around, but he never did. My grandpa had offered him the position at the family company as a final attempt to help him get on the right track, hoping he'd eventually be ready to take over. But he'd never taken the responsibility seriously, and now, after everything he'd done, my grandpa was done waiting for him to change. My dad must have sensed the end was near too, because he kept trying to contact me. He'd go on about how he was my real family and that I had no right to turn everyone against him. He even tried to frame everything that was happening as my fault, saying that I'd ruined his reputation and his career. It was exhausting, and at times I'd catch myself doubting whether I'd done the right thing by telling my grandparents everything. But every time, I'd think back to the years of neglect, the way he'd thrown me out like I was nothing, and I knew he was reaping what he'd sown. I stayed strong, blocking his new numbers whenever he tried to reach out. My grandparents told me I was doing the right thing, that I didn't owe him anything, and that they'd support me no matter what. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was surrounded by people who genuinely cared for me and who were on my side. It was a new kind of strength I hadn't known before, and it made me realize just how much I'd missed growing up. As the lawsuit dragged on, word spread through the extended family about what was happening. I'd been so used to keeping my head down and avoiding attention that I was surprised when relatives started reaching out to me, checking in to see if I was okay. It turned out that once they knew the truth, many of them felt outraged on my behalf. They'd never known what went on behind closed doors, but now that everything was coming to light, they could see my dad's true colors. The support from relatives I hadn't even been close with before was overwhelming, and it showed me just how much my dad had isolated me with his rules and control. After a few months, the lawsuit finally came to an end. My grandpa won, and my dad had no choice but to give up. The terms of the case were kept private, but I knew my dad had lost a lot, and he was no longer welcome at the company. With the lawsuit out of the way, my grandma was finally able to finalize the purchase of the company house my dad had been living in. Now, the house was officially mine. I still couldn't believe it. The same home I'd been kicked out of, where I'd felt so unwanted and unloved, was now under my name. The irony wasn't lost on me, and while I had no intention of moving in, knowing I had a place to call my own felt like a powerful statement. that I had reclaimed the parts of my life he'd tried to control. Once my dad realized he was truly on his own, he tried one last desperate tactic. He showed up at my grandparents' house unannounced again, demanding a meeting. This time, though, I knew I wasn't going to play into his hands. When I heard he was at the door, I went to my room, closing the door behind me. I knew he was hoping to manipulate me, to drag me back into his world of guilt and control, but I refused to give him that satisfaction. My grandparents handled it, calmly reminding him that his choices had led to this and that he was responsible for the outcome. From my room, I could hear the tension in his voice as he argued, trying to convince them to reconsider, to give him another chance. It was as if he'd finally realized the gravity of what he'd lost. But my grandparents were firm. They weren't going to be manipulated or guilt-tripped into helping him again. Eventually, he left, slamming the door behind him, and I felt a strange mix of relief and finality. I knew that was the last time he'd try to involve me in his mess. With my dad finally out of the picture, I was able to focus on my future. My grandparents encouraged me to start planning for college, and they assured me they'd support me every step of the way. For the first time, I felt genuinely excited about the future. I'd spent so long worrying about how to escape my parents' control that I'd never let myself dream about what I really wanted. Now I could finally start building the life I'd always hoped for, and my grandparents were right there beside me, cheering me on. As I prepared for college, I felt a sense of freedom I'd never known before. My dad's influence was no longer hanging over me, and I was finally surrounded by people who valued me for who I was, not for what I could do for them. I was free to make my own choices and to explore my interests and passions without fear of judgment or punishment. I could finally start becoming the person I was meant to be, without the weight of my dad's expectations holding me back. Life with my grandparents was still a bit of an adjustment. They were supportive and caring, but they also had a certain formality that reminded me of my dad. There were rules about punctuality, proper manners, and maintaining appearances, but it felt different with them. They genuinely believed in these values, not just as a way to control me, but as a way to instill discipline and respect. They took the time to explain things to me, to teach me, and to make sure I understood the reasons behind their expectations. For the first time, I felt like part of a family, like I was being guided rather than ordered around. In the weeks leading up to my college move-in date, my grandparents and I spent a lot of time together, talking about my plans, my dreams, and my goals. They were proud of me, and they made sure I knew it. I realized how much I'd missed growing up. Simple things like family dinners, conversations about my future, even just having someone who cared enough to ask about my day. These were things I'd never known with my parents, and now I was finally experiencing the love and support I'd always longed for. As the day approached, I felt both excited and nervous. This was the first big step toward a future I'd built on my own terms, and while there was still a part of me that feared the unknown, I knew I was ready. I was stronger than I'd ever been, thanks to my grandparents and the support of the family I'd never thought I could rely on. I knew there would be challenges ahead, but I finally had the confidence to face them. When I left for college, my grandparents hugged me tightly, promising to visit and reminding me that I always had a home with them. For the first time, I believed it. I knew they meant it, that I was truly part of their family. And as I walked onto campus, ready to start this new chapter of my life, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the support, the love, and the chance to finally, truly be myself. Moving to college felt like a breath of fresh air. I was on my own for the first time, surrounded by people my age, all figuring out their lives and navigating the challenges of independence. The excitement was contagious, and I found myself adjusting quickly to campus life. I was determined to make the most of this new chapter, and knowing I had the support of my grandparents gave me the confidence to dive in head first. My first semester went by in a blur of classes, new friendships, and late-night study sessions. It was challenging but fulfilling, and I started to feel like I was finally building a life that was mine alone. For the first time, I could focus on my interests without any pressure from my past. I joined a few clubs, started working part-time at the campus library, and even found a mentor who helped me explore career paths. Life was good. I kept in close touch with my grandparents, calling them every few days to share updates. They were always thrilled to hear from me, asking about my classes, my friends, and how I was adjusting. They told me how proud they were, and their encouragement made me feel like I was truly moving in the right direction. I even started making plans to visit them over winter break, eager to share all my stories and see them again. But as the months went by, my dad started creeping back into my life in subtle ways. He hadn't reached out to me directly since our last encounter, but I began hearing about him through the grapevine. Some relatives mentioned he'd rented a small apartment and was trying to get back on his feet, picking up odd jobs and networking to build some kind of independent career. Part of me felt a tiny flicker of relief that he seemed to be moving on, but I couldn't shake the sense that he hadn't fully let go. Then, a week before finals, I got a call from my cousin, someone I hadn't spoken to in a while. She sounded hesitant but eventually got to the point. My dad had been trying to get in touch with me through her. Apparently, he was reaching out to family members, asking them to help him reconnect with me. She'd felt uneasy about it, sensing that I might not want contact, so she called to give me a heads up. I thanked her and told her I appreciated her honesty, then asked her to keep my distance if he reached out again. The timing couldn't have been worse. Finals were around the corner, and my focus was already stretched thin, but even as I tried to push the thought of him away, he lingered in the back of my mind, his attempts to insert himself back into my life, stirring up old feelings of anger and guilt. I kept reminding myself that I'd made the right decision and that I didn't owe him anything, but the memories crept in. I remembered the years of neglect, the constant feeling of being a burden, and the way he'd discarded me without a second thought. I knew that reconnecting would only reopen those wounds, and I couldn't allow myself to go back. I finished my finals, powered through the stress, and tried to focus on the things that mattered: my friends, my accomplishments, and my future. As winter break began, I packed up my things and headed to my grandparents' house, ready for some much-needed time with the people who'd become my true family. When I arrived, my grandparents greeted me with hugs and smiles, and it felt like coming home. We spent the first few days catching up, sharing stories, and settling back into a comforting routine. It was exactly what I needed after the whirlwind of my first semester, and I started to feel the tension from my dad's attempted reappearance melt away. Here, I was safe. A few days before Christmas, however, the peace was interrupted. My dad showed up at my grandparents' doorstep unannounced. I was upstairs and my grandma came to get me, her face lined with worry as she explained that he'd come to talk things over. I felt a mix of anger and exhaustion. I didn't want to see him. I didn't want to risk being dragged back into his games, but I also knew that this might be the only chance to put things to rest once and for all. After taking a few deep breaths, I went downstairs. He was waiting in the living room, looking smaller and older than I remembered. Gone was the polished image he'd always presented, replaced by a man who seemed lost, almost desperate. Part of me felt a pang of pity, but I kept my guard up. I knew he was a master of manipulation, and I couldn't afford to let my guard down. He started off with a quiet apology, saying he regretted how things had turned out. He spoke about his mistakes, how he'd been under a lot of pressure, and how he'd just wanted a fresh start after the divorce. He tried to frame everything as a series of misunderstandings, as if his choices had been beyond his control. He even went so far as to say that he wanted to make amends, to rebuild our relationship, but he never actually admitted the real issue. He didn't take responsibility for kicking me out, for treating me like a burden, for putting his pride above his child. I listened quietly, letting him finish, but I kept my expression neutral. When he finally ran out of words, I took a deep breath and said, "I appreciate the apology, but it doesn't change what happened. You chose to kick me out, to make me feel unwanted, and I can't just pretend that didn't happen. I have a family now, and I don't need you to be a part of it. His face twisted in frustration, and he started to protest, insisting that he'd done his best and that I was being ungrateful. But I didn't let him get any further. I told him that the only reason I'd come downstairs was to make it clear that I was done with him. I had a new life now, one that didn't involve his manipulation, guilt trips, or empty apologies. I told him I hoped he found peace in his own life, but that mine no longer included him. With that, I turned and left the room. My grandparents had been listening from the kitchen, and when I walked past them, they nodded in quiet support. I could hear him arguing with my grandpa, trying to plead his case, but my grandpa shut it down, reminding him that he was a guest and that if he couldn't respect my boundaries, he would need to leave. After a tense few minutes, I heard the front door close and I knew he was finally gone. After that, my grandparents and I sat down together, and they reassured me that I'd done the right thing and that I was under no obligation to forgive him or let him back into my life. They reminded me that family was about love, respect, and trust, things he had failed to show me. For the first time, I felt a real sense of closure. I'd faced him, told him my truth, and held my ground. I didn't owe him anything more. The rest of winter break was peaceful. We celebrated Christmas together, laughing, sharing stories, and making new memories. I returned to college in January feeling lighter, like a weight had been lifted. My dad's shadow no longer loomed over me, and I felt truly free to embrace my new life. That semester, I threw myself into my studies, my friendships, and my job at the library. I felt stronger than ever, with a sense of purpose and clarity that I'd never known before. My grandparents continued to support me, cheering me on from afar, and I felt their love with me every step of the way. As I moved forward, I realized that my dad's choices no longer defined me. I was free to build my own legacy, to create a life filled with love and respect. I was determined to be the kind of person who valued family, not because of blood, but because of the kindness, loyalty, and understanding that real family provides. By the time summer came around, I'd fully embraced my new path. I looked back on the year with gratitude, knowing that despite the pain, it had led me to a place of strength and peace. My dad had tried to rewrite our story, but I'd reclaimed it, creating a narrative that was truly my own. And as I looked to the future, I knew I'd never allow anyone to take that from me again. As summer arrived, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened over the past year. It was hard to believe how much my life had changed since I'd left my dad's house. A part of me still felt the echoes of his rejection, but the pain was distant now, like a memory from someone else's life. I was free, and for the first time I felt like I was truly moving forward on my own terms. Over the break, I went back to my grandparents' house. They greeted me with open arms, like they always did, and I immediately felt at home. We spent long evenings in the backyard talking about my plans and dreams for the future. I told them about my classes, the career path I was considering, and my goals. They listened with genuine interest, giving me advice when I asked and encouragement when I needed it. Their love and support had become the foundation I was building my life on, and I couldn't be more grateful. During one of these conversations, my grandpa told me he wanted to put some things in place for the future. Specifically, he wanted to make sure the family business would be in good hands. He asked if I'd ever considered taking it over someday. The question surprised me. I'd spent so much time distancing myself from my dad's shadow that I hadn't even thought about the family legacy. But as I listened to my grandpa talk about the business, the values he'd built it on, and his hopes for its future, I began to feel a sense of pride in it. He didn't pressure me. He just wanted to know if I'd be open to learning more, to see if it was something I could see myself doing. And for the first time, I felt that this legacy wasn't a burden. It was a gift, one that I could shape and make my own. I told him I'd love to learn, and he smiled, saying that we'd start whenever I was ready. Over the summer, he introduced me to the basics of the business, teaching me about its operations and values, about the importance of integrity, and about how it had always been a point of pride for the family. Unlike my dad, who had only ever seen the company as a status symbol, I began to see it as something meaningful, a testament to my grandpa's hard work and dedication. I realized that if I chose to take it on, I could honor his legacy while making it my own, while my dad's presence faded from my life. I didn't hear much about him, except for the occasional family update. From what I gathered, he was struggling, moving from one low-paying job to the next, trying to make ends meet. His pride had taken a hit, and he no longer had the comfortable life he'd always taken for granted. I felt a strange mixture of pity and detachment when I heard about him. He'd made his choices, and now he was living with the consequences. I didn't wish him harm, but I didn't feel responsible for his situation either. By the time summer ended and I returned to college, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I'd gained clarity over the break, understanding that my past no longer defined me and that I had the power to build a life that reflected my values, not someone else's expectations. I returned to my studies with determination, driven by the realization that I was in control of my own destiny. The next few years were some of the best of my life. I continued to learn from my grandpa, absorbing everything he could teach me about the business and about life. He taught me the importance of hard work, of treating people with respect, and of building something with integrity. His influence shaped me, and I knew that when the time came, I'd be ready to carry on the family legacy in a way that honored his vision. My grandparents' unwavering support allowed me to thrive, and as I prepared to graduate, I felt a deep sense of pride in everything I'd accomplished. My dad's choices no longer haunted me. They were a distant memory, a reminder of a past that no longer held any power over me. I'd built a life rooted in resilience, kindness, and gratitude, values I'd learned from my grandparents who'd shown me what family was supposed to be. On graduation day, my grandparents were there, beaming with pride as they watched me walk across the stage. Afterward, we celebrated together, laughing and reminiscing about everything we'd been through. My grandpa pulled me aside and told me how proud he was, not just for graduating, but for the person I'd become. He said he knew I'd be an incredible leader, someone who could bring strength and compassion to the business, and he couldn't wait to see what I'd accomplish. I hugged him, feeling a swell of gratitude for everything he'd done for me. He'd given me more than just a place in the family business. He'd given me a sense of belonging, a foundation I could stand on, and the confidence to build a future I could be proud of. As I look back now, I realize that everything I went through, every hardship, every painful moment, had led me to where I am today. My dad's rejection had once felt like the end of the world, but now I see it as the turning point that brought me to my true family. It had opened the door to a life filled with love, purpose, and the chance to create a legacy that was truly mine. Moving forward, I'm determined to honor the lessons I've learned. I know there will be challenges, but I also know that I have the strength to overcome them. I'm proud of the person I've become, and I'm grateful to have a family who supports me unconditionally. My life isn't defined by my past, but by the choices I've made to rise above it. And as I step into the future, I know that I'm ready to carry on the legacy my grandparents have entrusted to me, with all the respect and integrity they've taught me to cherish. Thank you to everyone who followed this journey. The road hasn't always been easy, but it's led me to a place of peace and purpose. Here's to building a life filled with love, resilience, and gratitude. A life that, in the end, was worth every step of the way. Story 2. When my stepfather was being buried, my stepsister requested that I leave her dad's company. However, everyone was shocked when the will was revealed. I never imagined that I would be here, preparing for Robert's burial while seated in my apartment amid piles of old business documents and pictures. Robert, my stepfather, who for the majority of my life was both a rock and a pain in my side. Death forces you to reflect about everything, which is strange, as if every minute you previously believed to be meaningless suddenly took on significance. It has been quite hectic, to be honest. A single second. For R&L Enterprises, I'm filing reports and ensuring everything is operating as it should. The following day, I'm looking through old pictures and attempting to think of something to say during his funeral. I'm not even sure how I should feel about this. Do you simply forget everything because the individual is no longer there? Or do you always bear that burden? I suppose I ought to begin at the beginning. My mother, Anna, married Robert when I was 9 years old. The wedding was modest and uncomplicated, not very fancy. She looked stunning in this simple white dress, as I recall. She had such hope. as if this were her new beginning. In contrast, Robert appeared as though he was entering a business meeting. Straight face, black suit. Seldom did he grin. I should have recognized his character at that moment. Robert was not like other stepfathers. Not even a hug. Having you in my life makes me very happy. Speeches? No, he was all about discipline and organization. I was never able to determine whether he truly didn't care, or whether he simply didn't know how to handle a child that wasn't his. He was constantly observing and passing judgment. His eyes would narrow at me, as if I were always doing something wrong, even when I wasn't. I can still remember it. Being with him as a child wasn't always easy. I seemed to annoy him with everything I did. My grades are inadequate. I needed to dress better. It even affected how I handled my fork during dinner. Lena, you have to put forth more effort. The world isn't exactly slackers, he would say, and I do understand now. He believed that he was preparing me for life's harsh truths. However, it seemed like he was being cruel at the time. Our family's trips were far from restful. Robert meticulously prepared every detail. He remained upset for the remainder of the day after we arrived at a museum 15 minutes late. Not a joke. It seemed as though we had broken the law. He was unable to cope. It's not going exactly as planned. I detested those journeys. They had nothing to do with enjoyment or creating memories. They were merely another method by which Robert demonstrated to us the correct way to do things. Everything changed with the birth of Sophie. I recall watching through the glass from outside the hospital room. With this small infant in her arms, my mother appeared content despite being worn out. Robert, too. It was the biggest smile I'd ever seen on his face. It seemed as though a switch had been flipped. All of a sudden, he was a proud and loving father to a 9-year-old. It was a memorable moment. Oh, perhaps this is it, I thought. Perhaps things will improve. Instead, it seemed as though Sophie's entrance just served to emphasize my shortcomings. In his opinion, she was flawless, whereas I was not. Sophie could do no wrong from the start. Robert would run to her side, soothing her and cooing while she sobbed. I would sit there and observe, wondering why Dad was never so patient with me. Lena would often say, "Stop complaining or get over it," when I was upset. But things were different with Sophie. The preference became more apparent as she grew older. No matter how minor, Sophie's accomplishments were hailed as though they were the equivalent of an Olympic medal. Robert would adhere her scrawled drawings to the refrigerator as if they were works of art. Once, I brought home a report card that had all A's, and all I received was a short nod. Continue. No room in the refrigerator for my achievements. I didn't despise Sophie. After all, she was only a child. But when she dominated every aspect of our lives, it was difficult to avoid resenting her. One of the best examples was birthday celebrations. I can still clearly recall my 10th birthday. Robert handed me a little cake and a card. The three of us ate dinner together at home. Nothing noteworthy. But he booked out a whole play centre for Sophie's 5th birthday. Every child in her class was present, and there were games, balloons, and a magician. She was filling, unseen, and blowing out the candles as I was sitting in the corner. Furthermore, it went beyond birthdays. Daily existence was also different. Robert would simply laugh it off when Sophie made a mistake, spilled her milk, or neglected to complete her homework. He would say she's learning, but it would be catastrophic if I made a mistake. I attend lectures about accountability and the necessity for me to lead by example. I felt like I was being held to a standard that I would never be able to achieve. My mother's apparent blindness to it all was the thing that hurt the most. She would dismiss my attempts to speak with her Lena, you are loved by Robert. He wants you to be strong, which is why he is being harsh with you. Her favorite line was the one. It didn't lessen the pain, even though she could have believed it. My escape was school. Part of the reason I put myself into my academics was to establish my value. Additionally, it was the one location where I felt in charge. I worked hard even though I wasn't the smartest kid. I reasoned that if I couldn't please Robert at home, my grades might at least make him proud. However, it didn't appear to matter even that. It was never enough, no matter how brilliantly I performed. "You could do even better," he would say, "but good job." That was our relationship's central topic. Insufficient. He probably would have found something to criticize if I had been the world's president. The fact that Sophie had it so easy only made it worse. Robert would pretend that she had just found a cure for cancer when she received a B on an exam. It was more than just annoying. It was heartbreaking. I began to question whether I was the issue. Perhaps I simply wasn't as lovable. Perhaps he didn't want me as a daughter. The family dinners came next. Those were the worst. Robert would quiz us on our days while we were all seated around the table. It was all smiles and support for Sophie. It resembled a job interview to me. He would inquire about my future ambitions, friends and grades. And regardless of what I said, he always gave the same answer. Lena, you must perform better. It was more than words. His body language and tone both betrayed dissatisfaction. Those dinners were something I dreaded. I'd wait for the expected criticism while I pushed my food around my plate. I felt like I was climbing an endless mountain, even when I made an effort to live up to his expectations. When I did push back, it didn't work out. I recall a night when I was around 13. Robert kept talking about how I should consider my future, about how crucial it was to maintain concentration. I lost my temper. I told him I was sick of hearing criticism all the time, fed up with never measuring up. He just remarked, "Life isn't about being good enough, Lena," while maintaining his composure. It quote S about improving. Better every time. That was a word I detested. I had the feeling that I would never measure up to his expectations, no matter how hard I tried. Sophie didn't need to improve. Sophie had to be her. And it was sufficient. I had given up attempting to win his approval by the time I was in my late teens. I continued to put a lot of effort into my studies, but no longer for Robert. It was for me. I understood that I would never gain his approval, no matter what I accomplished. It was liberating, to be honest. I began concentrating on what I wanted instead of seeking his approval. However, that didn't mean the animosity vanished. It gnawed at me each time Sophie received another free pass, and each time Robert disregarded my attempts. I began erecting barriers with everyone, not just Robert. Not expecting anything from anyone was easier than constantly being disappointed. I can see now how much it influenced who I am. I gained self-reliance and independence. However, I also discovered how painful it is to feel inferior. To believe that you are never enough, regardless of what you do. The funeral day arrived sooner than I had anticipated. The way that time plays tricks on you is amusing. You're planning to go through old photos one minute, and then you find yourself in a room full of people all dressed up as funeral directors. They seem to truly understand what you're going through, as seen by their solemn expression and slightly cocked head. However, they don't. How were they able to? As individuals entered the funeral home, I stood close to the entrance and gave them a halting greeting. I recognized a few faces from the company. Others were longtime relatives. Then there were the unfamiliar people. Others who knew Robert better than I did. They would approach me, expressing their sorrow and praising Robert as a wonderful man. His family came first. One man shook his head as if it were a fundamental truth. I bit my tongue and simply nodded. First family? Yes, if Sophie is what you mean. Sophie, incidentally, was fashionably late, naturally. She arrived with her husband in tow, looking put together and confident as if she owned the area. She seemed even more put together than I remembered, even though I hadn't seen her in a long time. In the meantime, I felt completely disorganized. I sat down in the front row, directly close to my mother as the service began. With one hand on my arm and the other holding a tissue, she appears so frail. She didn't say much, but I could tell she was having difficulty. There were a few hints that Robert would have been pleased with the number of people who showed their I quote, "am proud." When that word was associated with Robert, it felt so alien. He had never expressed his pride in me as far as I could recall. It felt like I was hearing a story about a stranger when the eulogy began. They discussed Robert's leadership, his commitment, and how he started RNL Enterprises from the ground up. It seems like every phrase was intended to depict him as this fantastical character. But he just seemed complex to me, stern and aloof. Indeed, he does care in his own way at times. However, it was nothing like the man they described. Sophie was the next to speak. She approached the podium with the expression of a distraught daughter. She paused her speech just enough to sound sincere. However, I was aware. Being a father was not all that Robert was, she began. He served as my mentor, inspiration, and leader. I bit the inside of my cheek to prevent myself from rolling my eyes and tighten my fists. It seemed as though every remark was a performance designed to make her appear like the ideal daughter. Following the service, folks mixed together, catching up and sharing stories as if they were at a reunion. I tried to stay away from the small conversation by staying close to the edge of the room. Sophie discovered me at that time. She drew me away. Her demeanor was composed yet somber, as if she were going to break some news that would change her life. "We need to talk," she remarked in a stern yet hushed voice. Half expecting a sincere attempt to rekindle our connection, I followed her to a more peaceful place. Perhaps she would accept the years of unsaid conflict and the distance between us. However, that would have been asking for too much. "Lena," she started, crossing her arms over her chest. "I believe it's time to talk about the business." I scowled, taken by surprise. "The business?" "Yes," her tone said. As a matter of fact, Robert would have preferred that I assume control. It's the sensible option after all. "Reasonable?" I gazed at her, attempting to comprehend her words. "What are you talking about, Sophie? The will hasn't even been read yet." As like the specifics didn't matter, she shrugged. "Lena, you've always anticipated this. Come on, I've spent my entire life getting ready for this." Robert had complete faith in me. My stomach constricted. During Robert's illness, I worked late into the night to keep the business afloat. Everything happened in an instant, and now Sophie was standing there, behaving as though she would take charge. "It's not that easy, in my opinion," I spoke, attempting to maintain a steady tone. Sophie's eyes squinted, and her smooth appearance briefly fractured. "I'm not trying to be harsh, but you understand that the company requires someone who can relate to it. Lena. Someone with managerial abilities. And you believe that to be you." I suppressed the frustration that was rising to the surface. She gave me the patronizing smile I'd seen a million times as she cocked her head. "It has nothing to do with my opinion. It had to do with what Robert desired." I wanted to cry and tell her about all the late nights I spent servicing clients, working on reports, and doing everything I could to keep our businesses running. However, I didn't. I simply nodded instead. All the things I couldn't say were flying through my head. "All right," I whispered. "Let's see what Will has to say." Sophie flashed a little contented smile, but it seemed like she wanted to fight. "I suppose we will." I was overcome with a sense of despair and rage as she left. It seemed as though years of finishing second had prepared them for this moment. And Sophie consistently seems to win out in the end. The remainder of the day passed in a haze. People approached me with more anecdotes about the great Robert and condolences. I hardly listened as I nodded along. I couldn't get Sophie's confrontation out of my head. I knew there was more to come. By no means. I was worn out by the time I made it home. I collapsed on the couch and mentally relived the day. Sophie's speech, the service, and the eulogies. They all seemed like parts of a puzzle that I was having trouble assembling. I had to prepare myself for what was about to happen, because if there was one thing I knew for sure, it was that Sophie would not give up easily. It seemed like one of those slow-motion scenes in a movie on the day of the will reading. Something significant is about to happen, but the suspense is nearly intolerable, and you can't fast forward. In all honesty, I was bracing myself for the worst as I entered Mr. Bennet's office, partly expecting some big revelation. Sophie was already there, looking like she owned the place as she sat in one of those leather chairs. I knew her well enough to notice the small smirk that was hidden beneath her composed exterior. With a bland smile, I gave her a nod and sat down. Everything that we didn't say to each other made the room feel stifling. A stack of papers was carefully piled in front of Mr. Bennet, who was seated behind his large wood desk. His eyes were stern, but he smiled politely at us. "I appreciate you both being here." As he spoke, he started to shuffle the papers. "I'm aware that this is a challenging moment. To put it lightly, it was difficult. I could feel the stress coming from Sophie, and my heart was racing. She got right to the issue without wasting any time on small conversation. She leaned back in her chair and remarked, "Let's get this over with. I want to get started on my ideas for the business as soon as possible. plans for the business. The words hurt. She was behaving as though she already possessed it, as though the choice had been made before we had entered the room. I chose to let Mr. Bennet do his work and bit my tongue. After clearing his voice, he began to read the will. His tone was professional and steady. At first, it was the typical stuff. Personal things, funeral preparations. I was only listening, half listening, waiting for the important bit. Sophie, however, was sitting there looking confident, as if she knew precisely what was going to happen. Then it took place. Lena Davis, my stepdaughter, will inherit my whole fortune, including all shares and control of R&L businesses, since I, Robert Davis, am of sound mind and body. I briefly believed I had misheard. As I tried to take in the words, I blinked. The room fell silent, and my heart stopped. In an instant, Sophie's smirk disappeared, replaced with a shocked and incredulous expression. "What?" Leaning forward in her chair, she blurted out. That isn't possible." Mr. Bennet remained composed and nodded as he went on. "It's all written down here. Robert was quite explicit about what he wanted." Sophie's hands clenched into fists as her face flushed. "This is absurd." She lost her temper. "His daughter is me. I should own the business." As I sat there in shock, my thoughts were racing. It was unbelievable to me, after years of feeling like I was constantly in second place and never good enough. I was left everything by Robert. It was illogical. How come he would do that? Sophie had not finished. This must be an error. Her voice rose as she said, "There was no way Lena could manage the company. She is merely a stand-in." The words were powerful. However, Mr. Bennet interrupted me before I could respond. "There is no error," he stated confidently. After giving it some thought, Robert came to this conclusion. He even left behind a note outlining his justification. He handed me the packet he had sought for. As I accepted it, my hands were shaking. I glanced at the well-known handwriting. Mr. Bennet added softly, "You can read it later. However, you both must realize that this is final for the time being." Sophie's voice fell to a dangerous pitch as her eyes narrowed. "Do you think you'll just walk right in and take over? Do you believe you can manage the business without me?" A mixture of rage and resolve rose in my chest as I looked her in the eye. "Sophie, I didn't ask for this, but I'll try my hardest if Robert trusted me with it." She gave a sour laugh. "Your very best. It's a joke. Everything will be ruined by you." Even though my cheeks were getting hot, I wasn't going to give up. "We'll investigate that." Sophie grabbed her purse and sprang up suddenly. She shouted, "This isn't over," and hurried out of the room. Mr. Bennet and I were left alone when the door shut behind her. The quiet was overwhelming. The realization of what had just transpired weighed heavily. In an attempt to regain my composure, I inhaled deeply. "I understand that this is a lot to process," Mr. Bennet remarked quietly. "But Lena, Robert had faith in you. Perhaps you didn't see something in yourself, but he did." I gently nodded while continuing to hold the letter. "I simply don't get why he would do this." Mr. Bennet smiled a little sympathetically at me. The letter might be useful. With the envelope weighing heavily on my hands, I thanked him and walked out of the office. The world felt different outside. In just a few minutes, everything had changed, and I wasn't sure how to react. I was largely simply exhausted, but I also felt overwhelmed and relieved. I'm sick of battling, doubting, and constantly trying to prove myself. Sophie S comments replayed in my mind as I made my way to my car. It's not over yet. I could tell she meant it. For her, it was more than simply the company. It was intimate. It has been all along. I wasn't going to let her overshadow me, though, for once. I was trusted by Robert, and I had to respect that whether I knew it or not. After all the years I'd spent trying to be good enough, I owed it to myself. I sat in the driver's seat and looked at the envelope one last time before putting it in my backpack. That letter, whatever it contained, could wait. As Sophie mentioned, this was not over, so for the time being I had to concentrate on what lay ahead. By no means. That evening, I sat on my couch and gazed at the package containing my name. It seemed heavier than it should have, as if it contained all of the answers I was unaware I needed. Robert had nice handwriting, accurate, like every other aspect of him. I held it for a long time, wondering what I may hear from him. That when he was living, he was unable to tell me. Even though the room was silent, my thoughts were racing. Since the will, I had experienced a wide range of emotions: reading, confusion, rage, and shock. I was just numb now. I could still hear Sophie's response, her charges, her incredulity. The fact that Robert had picked me, however, was what really upset me. Following all those years of feeling inadequate, it seemed unreal. At last, the silence became unbearable to me. I took out a single sheet of paper from the envelope after sliding my finger under the flap. The words inside felt as though they had been waiting a lifetime to be read, despite the clean edges. I know I'll be gone by the time you read this, Lena. Although I felt compelled to write this letter, it wasn't an easy task. I should have told you some things a long time ago, but I was unsure of how to do it. Lena, I've made a lot of mistakes. I can't even begin to count. The way I treated you was one of the most significant. I am aware that I wasn't the father you were due. I was overly intent on improving you and too harsh on you. And I can see now how hurt you were by that. It was never because I didn't care. I want you to know that. On the contrary, I made a self-promise to raise you to be strong and self-sufficient the day I married your mother. Someone who was fearless in the face of the world. But I missed something crucial in the process. You needed more than lessons. You needed love. I could see how much effort you put forth to gain my approval, and it pains me to think that I never gave you the credit you merited. You've been more than capable all along, and I found that about you admirable. But I didn't tell you, and I apologize for that. I didn't make the decision to leave the business to you lightly. I gave it a lot of thinking, and this is what it ultimately boiled down to. You have repeatedly demonstrated your commitment, tenacity, and responsibility. More than anybody else, I have faith in you, Lena, to continue the legacy I established. You have earned it, not because you are my stepdaughter. I am aware that Sophie may not comprehend this decision. I also apologize for that. I let her down in a number of ways, in ways I might never completely comprehend. It's not about her, though. Despite everything, it's about you and who you've become. With any luck, this letter may help you gain some peace and clarity. I gave you more than you deserved. I am unable to alter that at this time. I do want you to know, though, Lena, I saw you. I always did. Look after the business. Know that I am incredibly proud of you, and take care of yourself. Robert. My hands were shaking by the time I had done reading. I had to blink away the tears that made the words on the page hazy. What I was seeing was unbelievable. Robert was stiff and stoic. Those were Robert's words. I had waited my entire life to hear those words. I'm proud. He expressed his pride in me. I gave a trembling breath. The letter felt like a lifeline as I leaned back against the couch, rescuing me from the whirlpool of uncertainty and bewilderment. All those years of feeling inadequate had kept me stuck. Like he would never be satisfied with anything I did. They seemed to have lost their significance. I reflected on my workplace nights and the late hours I spent making sure everything was just right. I was hoping he would notice. He had too. For the first time he had noticed, and I felt a strange mixture of relief and melancholy. Perhaps not in the way I wanted at the time. I was relieved to finally understand his feelings, but I was also saddened that it took his death for me to hear them. I wanted to ask him a lot of questions and say a lot of things. However, it was too late now. I carefully folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. It was something, but not much. I never imagined receiving so much from him. The burden of everything began to lessen as I sat there. Sophie, the business, the legacy Robert left behind. Everything seemed intimidating, but I thought I could manage it for the first time. I did so because I wanted to, not because I had to. Since Robert had faith in me, although I had no idea what lay ahead, I was certain of one thing. I wasn't going to be a waste of his faith in me. It was no longer only about demonstrating something to him. The goal was to prove it to myself. For the first time in a long time, too. I felt prepared. I felt different the morning after reading Robert's letter. Lighter, perhaps, as if a burden I was unaware I was bearing had been removed. However, that feeling of peace was short-lived. Sophie had no intention of letting this pass easily. To be honest, I didn't think she would. Shortly after breakfast, the The first call came in. Sophie's name was flashing on my phone while I glanced at it, wondering if I should answer. I was fully aware of her next words. However, there was a part of me that wanted to hear it directly from her. I picked it up and braced myself. Before I could even say hello, Sophie spat. "So I hope you're happy." I let out a sigh. "Sophie, good morning to you as well." She yelled, "Lena, stop the nonsense. This is wrong, you know that. I should own that business. My father would have preferred that I operate it." I inhaled deeply while attempting to maintain a steady voice. "I didn't ask for this, Sophie. Did I surprise you as much as you did?" Bitterly, she laughed. "You must be overjoyed. Have you not been anticipating this moment, trying to outdo me all the time? That struck a chord. Are you serious? Throughout my life, I have felt inadequate. And you're behaving as though I stole something from you now that I'm finally getting some attention." She fell silent for a while, and I had the feeling that she might give in. Then she returned with, "It's not over yet. This is going to be fought. RNL is not something you can do." She hung up after saying that. I sat there looking at the phone for a long time. A part of me wanted to lash out, to scream, to throw something. However, another section simply felt worn out. It has nothing to do with the business, not at all. It was about everything that had accumulated over the years between us. The worst kind of pouring was happening now. The days that followed were tense. I knew Sophie wasn't finished, but she didn't call again. The yelling was nearly as bad as the silence. I kept expecting her to surprise me at work or knock on my door. Instead, and this was totally out of character for her, she became radio silence. When things didn't go her way, Sophie was never one to keep silent. Then it took place. One of the board members knocked on my door while I was in the office reviewing some paperwork. We will refer to him as Mr. Daniels. He belonged to the old school, someone who had been a part of R&L from the start. "Lena," he remarked as he entered, "we must speak." I gestured for him to sit while nodding. "What, S happening?" He appeared a little uneasy as he cleared his throat. "Things have been coming to me. Sophie-related rumours. She has been challenging your ability to lead in conversations with some of the other board members. She was, of course," I asked, maintaining a bland expression. "Well, it's making me a little uncomfortable. A few members are beginning to question whether she might be right. My stomach dropped. Is she correct, in your opinion?" Daniels paused, which was sufficient response. "Lena, it isn't about right or wrong. Perception is key. Sophie has also been with the company and is causing quite a stir. People are paying attention." I reclined in my chair as the well-known weight of uncertainty began to creep in. "What should I do, in your opinion?" He let out a sigh. "You must demonstrate to them that you are in charge and that you can manage this. If not, Sophie may receive more assistance than you would desire." Fantastic. It was exactly what I needed. My own stepsister led a coup. I sat there looking at the mountains of documents on my desk after Daniels departed. Sophie had more in store for me than a personal challenge, and she was going to take a professional stab at me. What, S the worst? She was charismatic and had the connections to make it work. I convened a board meeting the following day. I wasn't going to give up if Sophie wanted to fight. I entered that room with the intention of establishing my legitimacy. It wasn't simple. There was a lot of tension, and I could see some board members looking at each other nervously. However, I outlined my goals for the business, taking care of every issue that came to me. I needed to prove to them that I was prepared, that Robert didn't just pick me out of sentimentality. I thought I had at least addressed some of the lingering doubts by the end of the meeting. Sophie remained the true obstacle, though she arrived at my office a few hours later. She simply pushed the door open and entered without knocking. "You convened a meeting without my presence." Her voice was full of sarcasm as she spoke. I calmly responded that it was a board meeting. "You're not on the board as of the last time I checked." She crossed her arms and scoffed. "It is really a technicality." I turned to face her. "What do you want, Sophie? Because I'm not in the mood to debate if that's why you're here." "What's rightfully mine is what I want," she replied, taking a step closer. "We'll have to do things the hard way, though, because you're so determined to play boss." I shook my head in frustration. It's not about what belongs to you. It has to do with what Robert believed was best for the business. Additionally, you may or may not like it. He put his trust in me for that duty. Her eyes sharpened, and I briefly believed she may strike me. Then she simply grinned. I had become accustomed to that icy, calculating smirk. Lena, we'll check on it. Let's see. She turned and left me standing there after saying that. I tightened my fists at my sides. The corporation wasn't the only thing affected. It was intimate. Rivalry and anger had been simmering for years, and I had a gut feeling that this battle was far from done. After everything fell apart a few weeks ago, I'm now beginning to feel like I can breathe normally again. I'm not going to lie. The situation has been tense. Even worse than her typical loud, theatrical actions, Sophie has remained quiet. It's similar to anticipating a storm that you know is coming, but are unable to see yet. Nevertheless, I've been moving forward and attempting to concentrate on the future. The business is a monster, without a question. I feel like I'm juggling 100 things every day, and something new keeps coming up that requires my attention. To be honest, while I was only lending a hand, I had no idea how much Robert kept for me. I feel like I'm seeing the big picture for the first time now that I am in charge. And it's overpowering, I tell you. It is, nevertheless, also rather empowering. I felt like I was in the background for a long time. Like I would never receive the credit I was due, no matter how hard I worked. However, those documents now bear my name, and the choices I make will determine how R&L Enterprises develop in the future. Yes, there is a lot of pressure, but I also feel like I'm finally taking charge of my own life. Not everyone is happy with the move, of course. On a few occasions, I have observed specific board members interacting with one another. It appears that they are still doubting my ability to manage things. However, following that first significant meeting, things began to change, if slightly. I'm not here to play games, like I stated. I care about this business, and I will stop at nothing to ensure its success. The letter from Robert is one item that has been really beneficial. Since that initial night, I've read it several times, and each time it strikes me in a new manner. Being aware that even when I didn't believe in myself, he saw something in me and had faith in me. It's strong. It serves as a reminder that I am doing this for myself as much as for the business or the legacy. To make this work, I owe it to the young girl who constantly felt left out. However, it's not only about meeting Robert's standards or proving myself to the board. What kind of leader I want to be has been on my mind a lot. Robert's emphasis on order and discipline was effective in several respects, but also caused a great deal of conflict. That's not how I want to run R&L. I want to establish a space where people's opinions are heard and they feel appreciated. I've started making some adjustments as a result. Not much yet, but enough to demonstrate that things have changed. To start, I've been meeting with staff members one-on-one more frequently, learning more about them and comprehending their worries. The amount of knowledge that can be gained simply by listening is astounding. People desire to be heard, and now more than ever I understand that. Launching a new project has been another significant milestone. I established a scholarship in Robert's honor using some of the money he left me. It is intended for children from difficult homes who may not have the same possibilities as others. Robert always valued education, and this seems like a fitting way to pay tribute to that while also giving back to the community. The reaction has been amazing. People have already thanked me in texts, expressing how much this will benefit their families. Moments like those make me understand that I'm making a difference in people's lives as well as the firm, and it's incredibly satisfying. But that nagging sense in the back of my mind persists despite all the progress. I know she's not finished, Sophie. She is too obstinate and accustomed to having her way to ignore this. Furthermore, I have no idea what she will do next. Perhaps she is secretly planning something, or perhaps she's simply holding out for the ideal opportunity to attack. I'm prepared for whatever comes next, though. I'm concentrating on the good things in the interim. The business is steady. I feel like the staff is getting to know me better, and I feel like I'm in charge of my own fate for the first time in a long time. I've spent a lot of my life trying to live up to other people's expectations, so it's a strange sensation. It's all about what I want now. Building something long-lasting is what I believe is right. Something that builds a future I can be proud of while simultaneously paying tribute to Robert's legacy. It won't be simple, I am aware of that. However, nothing is ever worth possessing. I can't help but feel a little hopeful as I sit here in my office and gaze out over the city. Yes, there are still obstacles to overcome. Sophie's shadow is also very noticeable. But I'm not afraid for the first time. I'm prepared to take on any challenge. Since I am now in my chapter, my opportunity to compose a new tale, not only for the business, but also for myself. I won't waste it either.